Well, welcome to another Humboldt Tea Time, and I'm very thrilled to say that this week our guest is Humboldt County Supervisor Steve Madrone.
Good
Steve,
morning.
it is so good to see you. Thank you very much for being our guest on Tea Time.
You bet.
We're here in the wonderful Eureka Visitor Centre again today, so thank you to them for hosting us today. Steve, you've been on the Board of Supervisors now about 4 years, roughly?
Yeah,
you
a little
just
more
got
than 4
elected for
years.
the second time. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But you have a whole history before that, because you grew up
Sure.
here in Humboldt, etc. Tell us about the history of Steve.
Well,
Excuse me, tea.
Yes,
Nearly forgot that.
tea,
You do
yes.
drink black tea, I hope.
I do. I do
Okay.
drink
Well,
black tea.
this is PG Tips, which
Good.
is a very famous British band. Anyway,
Nice.
I will give you milk and sugar. But anyway, tell us. Yes, what is the history of Steve?
Well, I came here in 1973, so 50 years ago.
Wow,
My 50th year
congratulations.
anniversary, and yeah, I feel like I grew up here. You know, coming at 20 years old, and came here to go to Humboldt State as a young boy, being a Boy Scout. You know, people ask you when you're young, what are you going to be when you grow up, right? And I would always say, I want to be a forest ranger. And so people would say, well, you should go to Humboldt State, or Humboldt College at the time. So Humboldt College, I got my bachelor's degree. Humboldt State University, I got my master's degree. Now it's Cal Poly Humboldt, right?
Right.
So,
you've seen
so
all
that's
the
what drew me
evolutions.
here, was the whole idea of being involved in the forests and the outdoors, that kind of thing.
Because you worked for the Forest Commission, didn't you? Or the Matoli Salmon Group. You were with them for quite some time.
Yeah.
And that was a very long-term project in terms of bringing back the fish habitat or something. That's been very much in the news just in this last week, with salmon fishing
Absolutely.
being shut down. Is that improving, or are things really still very worrying?
Well, you know, we're able to make improvements in small leaps and bounds forward, but it's a big issue because it involves the oceans, it involves the land. Salmon, of course, are anadromous, and so they go to the ocean for some of their life history, then they come back onto the land. So, yeah, there's a lot of challenges there. I think we're making headway, but there's a whole lot of challenges in terms of trying to really bring them back, and climate change is, you know, changing our forests, changing our watersheds, changing our rainfall patterns. Of course, we're coming out of one of our wetter years in a while. Although, do you know how much rainfall we have to date in terms of percentage of normal?
I don't, but tell me. I know it's high.
It's only 110%,
Yeah.
believe it or not, all right? You would think it'd be 150% of normal given what we've had. But, you know, I think we all got used to drier winters, and that's really what's going on. So this is a lot more like back in the early 80s with the El Nino winters. In the 90s and 2000s, we used to get really big winters, you know, and that kind of thing. So, so those patterns are changing. But the thing about salmon is that an adult salmon can lay 2,000 eggs, right? And the reason for that is because they need to be able to repopulate areas that maybe have suddenly come out from underneath a big ice shield after the Ice Age 10,000 years ago. And suddenly all these landscapes were open to them, and boom, they repopulate. So they're pretty resilient.
They are. But the removal of the dams is going to have a big impact, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
That's really the driving force to bring the salmon back.
Yeah.
To their native. Sorry about the motorbike
That's
outside.
okay, yeah.
See, it looks like he's driving off.
Well, that's the real world, right? You
Yeah.
gotta adapt. Yeah, the removal of the dams on the Klamath will absolutely have a positive effect for salmon. You know, it's a lot of people think, oh my God, that's all water for agriculture, but it's not. The Klamath dams actually don't provide, the ones that are coming out, do not provide water for agriculture. They're just simply for hydroelectric, you know, for electricity, and primarily for Southern Oregon. So we're working through all that. It's been a long time coming, and none of these things happen overnight, you know. So.
Now, this has always been your passion. It's something you worked in for a long time. So why did you wake up one morning and say, you know what, I want to get involved in politics. I want to be on the Board of Supervisors. What drove you to that?
Well, you know, I've always been political, and I know a lot of people think the word politician or politics is a dirty word. There's certainly plenty of behavior out there that could suggest that, but it really is the exchange of goods and services between ourselves. That's what it's about, and I love politics because it's where the rubber meets the road. You know, it's where people come together and work on issues and try and find a pathway forward, you know, to help take care of our community and provide good jobs, path forward for our children to want to stay maybe here and live in Humboldt County. So I've always been political by nature, and I first ran for office in 1983 in Blue Lake. I was on the city council, and became the vice mayor there and the police commissioner, and people were like, what the heck, how did we end up with a hippie police commissioner, you know? It's like, well, I'm law-abiding. I mean, you know, people have to label. We love to label each other in politics, and, you know, nobody really fits in that box that you give them. We all are far more complicated than, oh, he's a liberal, or he's a progressive, or whatever. I mean, frankly, I'm an extreme fiscal conservative, you know, and I think most of us are complex in that way. So I love the process. I love being able to work with people to get stuff done.
And of your time on the board so far, what would you say is your biggest win, your biggest success, the thing that's made you most happy?
Well, we're cutting the ribbon here, or cutting the new South Bay Trail, and that's something that I first envisioned 35 years ago. And we're so lucky to have a champion like Senator McGuire, who's got the power and ability at the state level to really bring the funding to the table to make that happen. So, you know, that's a 35-year project, 25 years since we really started investigating the Bay Trail process a lot more. So I would say that's one of my great accomplishments, is being involved in that. And I sit on the Great Redwood Trail Agency board as the vice chair as well. So
now we were lucky enough to speak to Senator McGuire a couple of weeks ago, and it's a project that he's absolutely passionate about. In fact, you were there at the same meeting, and he's also been instrumental in opening new parks in Arcata.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of negativity that say, well, look, there's homelessness, there's drug issues on the streets, etc. Why isn't that the priority rather than beautifying or beautification projects?
They're all important.
Yeah.
And the real question is, how do you get to each of them? How do you accomplish significant improvements in that particular issue? And one of the neat things about trails, for instance, is that while we think of them as just something for a weekend jaunt with our sweethearts or whatever it might be, it's also a transportation corridor. And it's where transportation equity actually meets the road, right? Because not everybody can afford a car. And so if you can get on a bike and you can walk, then trails help you get around in a safe way. But more importantly, when you're out on those trails, there's no Democrats, there's no Republicans, there's just people, you know, with children, with strollers, with rollerblades, walking with dogs, and you start getting to know your neighbors. When we get out of our cars and we get to know our neighbors, then we start lowering, you know, some of those barriers that allow us to actually work together. So to accomplish any problem, any issue you might bring up, whether it's homelessness or roads or housing or any of these things, first we have to be able to actually work together to get something done. And so I like to think of trails as one of those conduits for helping us get to know each other, you know, and figure out where we have our commonality. Because frankly, at the end of the day, just about all of us have maybe 80% in common with most of the people around us. But we choose to fight over those different points, you know, and my observation is that when you work with people and on common ground, you build trust, you build understanding, and then eventually you can start tackling some of the more difficult issues.
Well, I'm a cyclist myself, and I'm very passionate about public transportation, although it's not that great in this area.
Yeah.
So I've been thrilled that the trail is almost coming to Fields Landing, where I live. Not
Yes,
quite yet,
yes.
but now I can cycle all the way to downtown, where we are today.
Yeah.
On that. So it's going to be a great improvement, and there's going to be a big economic benefit as well.
Absolutely. It's a huge economic benefit. Millions and millions of dollars come in through trails. And you know, talking about South Bay Trail, Fields Landing, so there was a recent grant that Redwood Community Action Agency got that I used to work at for 25 years, and to plan and design the trail all the way to CR. And then, of course, we'll be going to Fortuna, and then the Great Redwood Trail will take it from there, you know, on down to the Bay Area. And it, you know, we're not going to be building the parts out there in the Eel River Canyon in the middle of nowhere right away. As you've seen, you know, the waterfront trail here in Eureka, the Bay Trail pieces, the Hammond Trail up north, and then we've got a bridge going over Little River to get us to Scenic Drive. So Annie and Mary folks have been working a long time on their piece, and Samoa, Manila folks are now starting to look at that piece, and Carlotta and Hydesville, there's a spur there as well. So all of these pieces are starting to come to fruition, and it just takes time, but one piece at a time. So.
What's next for Steve? What are you going to be? What's your next passion? Your next project? When that is? When, as you say, we're cutting the ribbon on the next stage very soon.
Yeah, well, you know, homelessness is this perplexing problem that just seems to never go away, and it's not easily solved. But again, I think, you know, if people a lot of people do have a lot of empathy and a lot of compassion, but it's really confusing, you know. One of the things I try to explain to people is that, do you know that we're spending $60,000 to $100,000 per year per homeless person, and that's not on services? That's on emergency room visits, hospital visits, jail costs, other kinds of problems that happen in the environment because people are trying to survive in the woods, in places they probably shouldn't be living, next to wetlands and streams and things like that. So if we're already spending that kind of money, and it's not actually going to solving the problem, wouldn't it be better as a taxpayer to actually go, what can we do with that money up front, and actually start helping those people that want help, that are capable of receiving that help? And it's really difficult to provide help to people when they're living in the woods. It's really difficult, right? So I talk to people in my district about, all right, you've already got a lot of homeless folks living in the woods nearby, and it's unsanitary, it's unorganized, it's just not okay probably. I'm sure. And they go, oh yeah, it really isn't, you know. And I say, okay, well, what if there was something in your neighborhood, but it was sanctioned? It had services, it had sanitation, you know, it had showers, it had dumpsters, and it had people there 24/7 to help manage it, take care of it, and make it so that people could get to services. Wouldn't that be better for you and your neighborhood? And they're like, yeah, but, you know. And so if I can get them to but, you know, and get them to accept it, let's give it a try. Let's figure out how we can do these things. Tiny home villages are a piece of the solution. There's no one piece that's going to solve it all. But for instance, the Hoopa Valley tribe has a modular plant that builds homes, but it's been shuttered for the last 10 years for a number of reasons. And we're talking about getting funding to try and help them get that back up and running, put some tiny home villages on the reservations. They have a housing need as well. And then start contracting with the counties around Hoopa to build so many of these per year, find that surplus property at the county or state level, and put some of these villages together on those places. Some of the solutions going to be ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, where you build these mother-in-law-like units or, you know, student-like units in the backyard. And almost every parcel now can build one of these units in their backyard. If they have a single-family residence, they can build one of these units. So the solutions are going to come in multiple ways, and it's going to be through cooperation and funding and nonprofit partners that you have to be able to step up and help manage it all.
And you talked there briefly about services to local communities and how important they are. You yourself live in Trinidad.
I do.
And actually we just saw recently that Trinidad has a volunteer fire department. They don't rely on CAL FIRE, etc. But that's being wound up. What impact is that going to have on the community when there is a fire?
Yeah, well, it can have a huge impact, and cities actually are required to have a fire department, so they've got to find their way to resolving that. Basically, what's happened is the existing volunteers are like myself, getting older, even older than myself, and you know, pulling hose and stuff in a fire, that's just not going to be happening if you're 80 years old. So we've been meeting with the city, with West Haven Volunteer Fire, ORIC, CAL FIRE, Arcata Fire, which also covers McKinleyville, and talking about how we can change the service arrangement and expand those services by getting some of the partners in the area who currently aren't paying into services. Like City of Trinidad, they kept their own department going, but there's this thing called the CSA 4, or Community Service Area 4, that provides funding to CAL FIRE to provide us with an engine and 2 people all winter, so during the off-season, right? But Trinidad doesn't pay into that, nor does the Trinidad Rancheria. So if we can get both those partners to pay in, then we'll have more resources to be able to do something. But in addition to that, you know, in Sonoma County, they consolidated the fire services. Instead of having 30, 40 different departments, I think they've got like 4 branches. And it's all kind of consolidated under the county to some degree, and that works a lot better. Saves a lot of money on administration and things like that. So we're coming together, rallying around Trinidad and working to figure out how we can, you know, all share in those services and the costs of them. So lots to do there.
A fair bit, and of course we are getting closer now to fire season. It was quite worrying last year, so let's fingers crossed that can be resolved.
First sunny day in a while.
So I just wanted to end by sort of asking you talked about cooperation and you talked about sharing ideas, etc. there seems to be always contention within the Board of Supervisors, which I suppose there should be, disparate opinions. But how do you resolve that? I mean, how do you work as Steve as the individual, but also working with your board members, some of whom have very different viewpoints to yours?
Thank goodness they do, right? I mean, it's actually something to cherish, that difference, right? Because if we were all alike and thought the same things, I don't think we'd solve our problems nearly as well. So I relish the diversity, and people have been coming up to me since I took over as chair of the board, just 3.5 months, 4 months ago. And there used to be this thing called the Gang of Four. It went on for a long time, and now people are saying, oh, so what are we going to call you and Mike and Natalie, the Gang of Three? And I said, no, you can call us the Team of Five, because that's what we are. We're a team of 5 people. And thank goodness, like I said, that we have different opinions, different experiences and ideas. But if we can respect those differences, that's the word, respect. And when we respect, and I think you're seeing this on the board, I think everybody's working really hard to try and find that level of respect for the other person's opinion. The Planning Commission, we knew that appointment was going to go sideways, and there was going to be a few on one side, one person, and a few over here, one another. And so I attempted a ranked choice voting process, which got everybody a little confused. But in the end, we started out completely separated. In the end, we had a 5-0 vote for the person that we picked as our top choice. So we went through a process. And when you have that process and you are respecting each other, I believe that you can get to a place where you can work better together and solve problems. And frankly, I think that's what people elect us to do, is to get in there and put our differences aside, respect them, bring them out, but at the end of the discussion, try and rally around the best decision we can make. So.
Now, there was quite a mild controversy, but it still worked within the board recently when one of your esteemed colleagues, Mr. Bone, made some what were deemed as inappropriate comments at a charity fundraiser, and that really upset Supervisor Arroyo. So there seems to be elements of a personal conflict as well, that, as far as the public are concerned. Do you think that really exists? I mean, she did ask for an apology for that.
Yeah, these things are pretty complicated, and behind the scenes complaints can get filed through the Code of Conduct policy, and that has in fact occurred. Yeah. And so there's a process that occurs, and when that's happening and there's an investigation, it would be highly inappropriate from my perspective for me to be, jumping into that and piling on. There's this thing where, somebody makes a mistake, and that was a really bad one, and it's happened before. And that kind of behavior doesn't change unless you really embrace the things you need to do to be able to get the help to help you change. We all do things that are not okay, but it's the ability to change ourselves that I think matters. And so that was a bit of an intense conflict there. It hasn't gone away necessarily, but I don't see people holding grudges, at least most of us, I think, trying to move forward and figure out how to be able to do the business at hand. And those things are unfortunate when they happen, but when the president of the country can do those kinds of things, is it surprising that others think that behavior is okay? And it's not okay. It was never okay.
Well, I think we should probably stress the former president of the country.
Yes, there we go. Yes, please.
Actually, I saw in a bio. Actually,
in the news every day.
Well, yes, still. I saw actually in a bio that I was reading about you. You actually said Bernie was your political hero. Bernie describes himself as a socialist. Now, I grew up in a socialist government, actually. There was one elected the week before I was born. I don't recognize socialism in the American sense as real socialism. Do you consider yourself a socialist?
See those things out there with that blacktop? What is that? It's a public road, right?
Right.
That's socialism right there. What about police services, fire services? That's socialism, right? So again, we put labels on things. But in fact, we're far more complicated than that. We are a country that believes that certain services absolutely should be socialized. Public schools, libraries, roads, police, and fire. These are all social services. Your Social Security you get when you retire. That's socialism, right?
But oddly not health.
Yeah, it is interesting on that one, and that gets into the money behind all that, and pharmaceutical corporations are probably the most wealthiest entities on the planet, right? And so that's a complicated one for sure. But other things, we use the capitalist, approach, capitalistic, maximizing profits, the freedom to be able to make investments and get a return. And so this country is a mixture of those things. I would say to you that even in so-called socialist countries, it's a mixture.
Yes, it is.
It depends on how far it shifts one direction versus the other. For instance, in Finland, Norway, Sweden, in those countries, they're really big on taking a lot of tax money from you, and then they provide some of the best health services in the world, you know, and they don't have the problems with homelessness like we do. Are people happy they get taxed so much? I don't know, but if their problems are being solved, I mean, that's been my observation. People don't like to be taxed when they don't see the benefit from it.
That's a good point.
But if you know you're going to, for instance, if we were to put a half-cent sales tax on the ballot for roads, I think everybody agrees the county roads are falling to heck. I mean, we got to do something. We've got to come up with some resources to change that. Otherwise, we're spending it all on tires, shocks, alignments, and the rest. So it's this whole idea that in many cases you're already spending all that money, but are you spending it in a smart and a fruitful way that actually accomplishes certain goals? And it'd be a lot cheaper to pay a half-cent sales tax than, I think the average is $900 per car is being spent on repairs related to poor roads, right? So I like looking at those things and going, this is really wasteful the way we're operating. How do we turn that around, and how do we convince the voters and the taxpayers that it makes sense, right? That's data. That's science-driven.
Well, as a cyclist, I can vouch for some of the roads around here. I can tell you that's absolutely true.
Oh, my God.
So, Steve, you're just starting your second term. Is there going to be a third term for Steve?
You know, I leave those things to the future. Right now, I'm focused on this term and doing everything I can right now. And I have no idea what the future is going to bring for my family, myself, or the county. I do like the fact that I'm in the majority for the first time really in my life. I mean, I've been in the minority my whole life on many, many things, right? And so one of my colleagues like to say, well, I can count to 3, you know. I said, get over it. You know, I've been in the minority my whole life. And just because you're in the minority doesn't mean you don't have a voice and that we can't work together, right? So
that's a very good point.
And frankly, we don't all just lock up and vote exactly the same. For instance, last week on the canine dog issue and the letter to the legislature opposing that bill. And, you know, it had a lot to do with the fact that in some areas, in the more populated areas, sometimes the dogs are being used for crowd control. And there seems to be data suggesting that they're used more intensively on people of color than they are on people of white. And is that a racist thing on the part of the dog? I don't think so.
Probably not.
It's the handler, right? It's the handler. Dogs take cues from human beings, right? So it looks like we don't really have a problem locally with that. And if we did, we could certainly set a policy at the board for the sheriff's department in regards to canines. We don't have to have the legislature do that for us. So I voted with Rex and Michelle because it was the right thing to do in my mind on that issue. So I don't think people are going to find that it's going to be so easy to just go, oh, these 3 are just going to, or these 2. No, I think you're seeing the board starting to listen better to each other and find their way forward to a pathway that's more cooperative. That's at least my hope.
Well, Steve, I share your hopes. I don't know what to do. Bring tea to the next board meeting and have everybody have a cup of tea, and that will work. Well, Steve, it's a real pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
For telling us your story today.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us for another Humboldt Tea Time. Thank you very much indeed to the Eureka Visitor Centre for hosting us again today. It's a really beautiful facility, and we'll look forward to seeing you for another Humboldt Tea Time very soon.
Tea.
Do you like the tea?
It is good.
Okay.